She was the most photographed woman on Earth. She died before she could finish raising them. Diana Spencer gave birth to 2 sons inside the most scrutinized family in human history, and then spent the rest of her short life trying to protect them from it. She took them to homeless shelters and AIDS hospices. She drove them through McDonald's drive-thrus in disguise. She told friends she was terrified of what the institution would do to them once she was gone. She was right to be terrified. William became the heir who learned to disappear into duty. Harry became the son who broke from everything, the palace, the country, the family, and finally his own brother, in ways that are still unfolding today. This is not the story of a car crash in a Paris tunnel. This is the story of what happened to 2 boys who lost their mother at 12 and 9 years old, were forced to grieve in front of 1 billion strangers, and were then handed over to the very institution Diana spent her life fighting. One of them accepted it. One of them couldn't. Both paid a price no amount of royal privilege could cancel. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The woman who knew exactly what she was handing her sons. Before we get to William and Harry, we have to spend a moment with Diana herself. Not the icon, not the people's princess, not the woman in the ivory silk dress with the 25-foot train, but the mother. Because understanding what she tried to build for her sons is the only way to understand how devastating it was when she was no longer there to protect it. Diana Frances Spencer was born on July 1, 1961, into a family that already knew something about loss and expectation and the particular cruelty of being found wanting. Her parents had desperately wanted a son. She arrived instead, unwanted in the specific way that only a child born into disappointment can be unwanted. Not unloved exactly, but not quite what was hoped for. Her brother Charles came 3 years later, and by then the marriage was already crumbling. Her parents separated when she was 6. The divorce was finalized when she was 8. She grew up shuttling between homes, raised largely by nannies, watching from a distance as the adults in her life failed to hold themselves together. She carried that childhood into everything that followed. The loneliness of it, the hunger for warmth that the cold architecture of her family had never quite provided. And when she married into the most formal institution in the world at 20 years old, she brought with her a need for emotional connection that the palace was structurally incapable of meeting. By the time William was born in June 1982, Diana already understood that the life she had entered was not what she had been told it would be. The marriage was troubled from its earliest months. Charles had never stopped loving Camilla Parker Bowles, and Diana, for all her youth and her hope, had known that before she walked down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral. She had scanned the pews for Camilla's pale gray hat and found it. She had gone ahead anyway. What this meant for the 2 boys she would raise inside that marriage is something that takes a while to fully land. William and Harry did not grow up in a peaceful home. They grew up in a home where their mother cried behind closed doors, and their father was emotionally absent in a way that had nothing to do with his schedule and everything to do with where his heart actually was. They grew up watching their parents perform a marriage for the cameras while living something entirely different behind the palace walls. And Diana, who had spent her own childhood watching adults perform emotions they didn't feel, was determined that her sons would not grow up emotionally hollow. She was ferocious about it. She insisted on it in ways that made the palace deeply uncomfortable, because the palace ran on restraint, on the careful management of feeling, on the performance of dignity in place of the expression of actual humanity. Diana was not interested in any of that, and she made sure her sons knew it. She told them she loved them, constantly, openly, in front of staff and security and whoever else happened to be in the room. She hugged them, she roughhoused with them, she sat on the floor and played with them. She kissed them in public in ways that raised eyebrows among courtiers who considered physical affection between a royal mother and her children to be faintly undignified. She did not care what the courtiers thought. She never had. She also made deliberate choices about what she exposed them to. The McDonald's trips were real. She would load them into a car with minimal security and drive through in disguise, just a mother and 2 boys getting hamburgers. And she believed that the ordinariness of it, the queuing, the paper bags, the fizzy drinks mattered. It was practice for a version of life that their position would otherwise make entirely inaccessible. But she went further than McDonald's. She took them to a shelter for homeless people in London when they were still very young. She brought them to hospitals. She wanted them to understand that the world contained people who had nothing, and that the accident of birth, which had given William and Harry everything, created not just privilege but responsibility. She said she wanted to put them in situations where they would be confronted by need, by suffering, by the reality of lives lived outside the palace gates. She also told them about her own struggles, more than most parents would, more than the palace thought was appropriate. She spoke to them about depression, about the eating disorder she had battled through the worst years of her marriage, about the loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling completely alone. Some who knew the family thought she shared too much, that it placed a burden on children who were not equipped to carry it. But Diana's view was the opposite. She believed that secrets were the thing that damaged children, that the careful performance of happiness over authentic unhappiness was the real danger, the thing that had wrecked her own childhood and the childhoods of so many people she knew. William was the one who slipped tissues under the bathroom door when he heard her crying. That detail has become one of the most cited images of his childhood, and for good reason. It tells you everything about the emotional atmosphere of that household. A small boy, uncertain how to help, doing the only thing he could think of. A mother on the other side of the door, suffering openly enough that her son could hear it. And between them, a door that stood for everything the palace wanted to keep closed. Harry, younger and perhaps more naturally emotional, absorbed the atmosphere differently. He was the wilder of the two, the louder one, the one who made people laugh and deflected with humor and seemed to move through the world with a lightness that William, already being shaped by the weight of his future role, couldn't quite access. But those who knew him well said the lightness was real and also a cover, that underneath it, Harry felt things with an intensity that he had no framework for processing. Diana saw both of them clearly. She worried about William's future in a specific way, the way a person worries when they can see exactly what is coming and cannot stop it. She worried that the institution would sand down everything human in him, that the training for kingship would replace the boy she had raised with a function, a symbol, a performance of royalty that had nothing to do with who William actually was. And she worried about Harry in a different way. Harry was the spare, the second son. In the brutal mathematics of royal succession, he was the insurance policy. He would have all the restriction of royal life and none of its purpose, all of the scrutiny and none of the clear role that gave William's existence its shape. Diana saw that as a recipe for a particular kind of pain, and she was not wrong. She died before she could protect either of them from what was coming, but she had given them something, both of them. A capacity for feeling, for connection, for genuine human warmth that the institution had not given their father, and that the institution would spend the next decade trying, with mixed success, to train out of them. August 31st, 1997, and the morning after. There is a version of this story that begins with the crash in the Pont de Lama tunnel. We are not going to linger there. What matters for this story is not how Diana died, but what happened to her sons in the hours and days and years that followed. Charles woke William and Harry in the early hours of August 31st, 1997, at Balmoral Castle in the Scottish Highlands. He told them their mother was dead. William was 15. Harry was 12. The details of that conversation belong to the three of them, and neither William nor Harry has ever disclosed exactly what was said, or how their father delivered the news, or what the room felt like in the moments after. What we know is what came next. The institution moved immediately to manage the situation in the way the institution always managed things, by closing ranks, by maintaining protocol, by keeping the family together in Scotland away from the crowds gathering in London, and by saying as little as possible for as long as possible. Queen Elizabeth II, operating according to the traditions that had governed the monarchy for decades, remained at Balmoral. The flag over Buckingham Palace flew at full mast. No public statement of substance came from the royal family in the first critical days. The palace was grieving, or at least processing, in the way the palace always processed things, privately, formally, and with a discipline about public emotion that struck the watching world as something close to indifference. The public reaction was unlike anything Britain had seen. The flowers began arriving at Kensington Palace within hours. By the end of the first week, the piles stretched 30 feet deep in places, more than 1 million bouquets. People who had never met Diana, who had only ever seen her in photographs and on television screens, were weeping openly in the streets of London. Mental health lines were overwhelmed. Grief counselors were deployed to public gathering spaces. An entire nation was processing a loss that was personal to almost none of them and felt devastatingly personal to all of them. And in the middle of all of this, 2 boys were in a castle in Scotland, surrounded by family, separated from the city where their mother had lived, unable to see the flowers or hear the crowds or participate in the collective mourning that was happening without them. Harry has said in interviews since then that he was numb, that the shock was so complete and so total that he did not feel grief in the conventional sense, not crying, not collapsing, not the physical breakdown that people might have expected from a 12-year-old boy who had just lost his mother. He felt, he has said, almost nothing, which was its own kind of horror. William was older, more aware of what was required of him, already beginning the long process of understanding that his grief was not simply his own, that it belonged in some sense to the institution and to the public and to the cameras that were already gathering outside every place he might possibly appear. He held himself together with the discipline that Diana had always worried would be asked of him too soon. The funeral was September 6, 1997, 6 days after Diana died. 6 days in which William and Harry existed in a kind of suspended state, shielded from the full weight of public attention, but not from the knowledge that the entire world was waiting. The decision to have William and Harry walk behind the coffin through the streets of London is one that has been debated and re-examined many times in the years since. It was not a decision they made themselves. They were 12 and 15. Adults decided. The palace decided. Charles agreed. Prince Philip, who walked alongside them, reportedly told Harry that if he walked, history would remember it, and that seemed to be the argument that persuaded them. What history actually recorded was 2 boys trying not to break. The route from Kensington Palace to Westminster Abbey was 1.2 miles. The crowds that lined it were hundreds of thousands deep. The silence was broken only by the sound of the gun carriage wheels on the road and the occasional sob from somewhere in the crowd. William has said he fixed his eyes on the back of the head of the person in front of him and did not look up. He was afraid that if he looked at the crowd, at the flowers, at the faces of people weeping for his mother, he would not be able to keep walking. Harry walked beside him, 12 years old, wearing a suit, maintaining a composure that no 12-year-old should ever be required to maintain. He would say, nearly 20 years later, that he had no memory of large portions of that day, that his mind had simply gone somewhere else in order to survive it. The eulogy was delivered by their uncle, Earl Spencer, Diana's brother Charles, and it was extraordinary in its directness. Spencer spoke about the woman Diana actually was, her warmth, her humor, her insecurity, her need for kindness as much as she gave it. And then he said something that addressed the boys directly, in front of the world, promising that the Spencer family would do everything in its power to continue the imaginative way in which Diana was steering their lives, to ensure they did not simply lose themselves inside duty and tradition. The applause started outside the Abbey and rolled through the open doors. It was the first time in living memory that applause had been heard inside Westminster Abbey during a funeral. The crowds outside were cheering, not with joy but with recognition, with relief that someone had finally said plainly what many of them had been feeling. William and Harry sat inside and heard it. It is difficult to know what they made of it. They were children. They were in shock. They were dressed in suits and required to sit still while the world watched them bury their mother. After the Abbey, Diana's coffin was taken to Althorpe, the Spencer family estate in Northamptonshire, where she was buried on a small island in a lake. William and Harry did not attend the burial. It was private, for family only, and the decision was made to spare the boys the final moment of the coffin going into the ground. They went back to Balmoral instead. and the world moved on to the next news cycle, and William and Harry were left inside the institution that Diana had spent her life fighting, with the grief they had not yet been allowed to feel, and no one who had known their mother the way she had known herself. The years inside the palace, William's path. In the months that followed Diana's death, a decision was made, largely by Charles and his advisors, that the boys needed normalcy, that the best thing for them was to return to school, to maintain their routines, to be around their peers rather than being kept in the palace atmosphere of grief and adjustment. William went back to Eton. Harry went back to Ludgrove, his prep school, and both of them did what British boarding school culture had trained generations of boys to do with pain they didn't know how to process. They buried it. They got on with things. They performed normalcy so convincingly that the people around them, teachers, friends, even family members, largely accepted the performance as the reality. William in particular was extraordinarily composed. He was 15, and he was already performing the role of someone who was fine, who was handling it, who was moving forward. The palace found this reassuring. His teachers found it impressive. Almost no one around him understood, or perhaps allowed themselves to understand, that composure is not the same thing as healing, and that the emotional work Diana had tried to prepare her sons for was being systematically bypassed by the very institutions that were meant to be caring for them. Harry was less convincing. His performance of fine was more ragged, more frequently interrupted. He was 12, and he was missing his mother in a way that was too big for the container of Ludgrove's expectations. He acted out. He got into trouble. He was, by his own later account, a mess underneath the surface. But the surface was all anyone seemed interested in inspecting. Charles was not an emotionally absent father in the obvious sense. He was present. He was engaged. He took the boys on trips. He made sure they were looked after. But he was also a man who had been raised in an institution that treated emotional expression as a kind of weakness, and whose relationship with his son's mother had been the defining disaster of his adult life, and who was also trying to manage his own grief and his own complicated situation with Camilla, while simultaneously running a monarchy in the wake of the most public crisis it had faced in decades. He did his best. His best was not always enough. The boys grew up. William went to St. Andrews University in Scotland, where he studied art history, and where in his first year he met a girl named Catherine Middleton who was living in the same student residence. Harry went to Eton, where he struggled academically and socially in ways that periodically made the tabloids, and then to Sandhurst, the military academy, where he found something that would matter enormously to him for the next decade, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with his surname. William's time at St. Andrews is significant not just because of Catherine, but because of what it represented. It was, for a few years, the closest thing to a normal life that William had ever had or would ever have again. He was recognized, certainly. He was followed by security. The press knew where he was, but St. Andrews was small enough and protective enough that he could walk to lectures, eat in the dining hall, go to pubs with friends, and exist in a way that was closer to ordinary than anything his childhood had offered. He and Catherine became friends first, then something more. Their relationship developed slowly, over years, with the particular caution of two people who both understood what was at stake. Catherine was not royal. She was not aristocratic in any meaningful sense. She was the daughter of self-made parents who had built a successful party supplies business, and the tabloids, who had been waiting since Diana's death for the next great royal romance, were not always kind about that. But she was also steady, patient, capable of a quiet resilience that William, who had been surrounded by instability for most of his life, found genuinely sustaining. She was prepared to wait. She did wait, through years of a relationship that was serious but not yet formalized, through a period when they briefly broke up in 2007 and the press went into a predictable frenzy, through all of it. They were engaged in October 2010 in Kenya, with his mother's sapphire and diamond engagement ring. The ring was Diana's. Charles had given it to her in 1981. Harry had been given the choice of which of his mother's pieces of jewelry he wanted when the estate was divided, and he had initially chosen the ring. He later gave it to William because he knew William was going to propose to Catherine, and because it felt right that the ring should be on the hand of the woman who would one day be queen. That gesture matters. It tells you something about the relationship between the brothers at that point, the generosity of it, the shared understanding of what the ring represented and who should wear it. They were still, in 2010, each other's closest ally. The person who understood, without explanation, what the other had been through. The wedding was April 29, 2011, Westminster Abbey, a global television audience estimated at nearly 2 billion people. William stood at the altar and waited for Catherine to walk toward him, and the world watched. And somewhere in the watching was the ghost of 1981, of another dress, another cathedral, another marriage that had been presented as a fairy tale and turned out to be something more complicated. William was not his father. Catherine was not his mother. They had known each other for nearly a decade before they stood at that altar. They had chosen each other with their eyes open, as adults, with full understanding of what the life ahead would require. And yet the weight of comparison was inescapable, and William knew it, and Catherine knew it, and the institution knew it, and they all carried it into the Abbey and tried to put it down long enough to get married. They had 3 children: George, born July 2013, a future king; Charlotte, born May 2015, a princess who has already shown signs of her grandmother's directness; Louis, born April 2018, the youngest, who has become famous primarily for the faces he makes at public events, a trait Diana would almost certainly have found hilarious. William became, in the years following his marriage, exactly what the institution had always needed him to be: dutiful, reliable, increasingly assured in his public role. He undertook royal engagements with a seriousness that impressed even his critics. He served in the military, flew search and rescue helicopters for the RAF, became patron of charities that reflected his mother's values, if not always her methods. He launched Heads Together, the mental health initiative, alongside Harry and Catherine, which represented the most explicit acknowledgement the palace had ever made that the royal family had feelings, and that those feelings sometimes required professional help. The mental health work was significant and was also personal. William spoke in interviews about the years following Diana's death when he simply refused to process his grief, when he locked it away and got on with things and told himself that was strength rather than avoidance. He spoke about eventually understanding that the avoidance had cost him, had made him less capable of the very connection he most valued. He encouraged people to talk. He meant it. He had learned it the hard way. But William had also, by this point, absorbed something from the institution that Diana had feared he would absorb. He had learned to manage, to contain, to operate within the rules of a system that had very clear ideas about what was permissible and what was not. He was not hollow, he was not cold, but he had found a way to hold his private self in a separate container from his public role, and he had gotten very good at keeping the lid on. This would matter enormously when his brother began to remove the lid entirely. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Harry, the years of numbness and what came after. Harry's path after Diana's death was darker and longer and more publicly visible in its darkness, which is its own kind of irony given that what he most wanted for most of his life was to be seen as a person rather than a symbol. He went to Eton, where he struggled. His grades were poor. His behavior was sometimes erratic. He was photographed at a costume party in 2005 wearing a Nazi armband, a choice of such staggering stupidity that it dominated headlines for weeks and required a public apology that Harry later said he delivered with full understanding of how badly he had erred, and also with the private knowledge that he was, at 20 years old, still a young man who had not developed the judgment he needed because he had not yet done the work of figuring out who he was. He went to Sandhurst in 2005 and found, for the first time in his life, something that felt genuinely his. The military did not care about the firm, or the cameras, or the succession. It cared about performance, about the ability to function under pressure, about being a member of a unit that depended on you. Harry was good at it. He was physically brave, practically capable, and possessed of the kind of easy warmth that made him genuinely liked by the people who served alongside him. He deployed to Afghanistan in 2007 and 2012. The second deployment lasted nearly 5 months and involved significant combat exposure. He was operating Apache helicopters, which are attack aircraft, and he was in a role that required him to make decisions in the moment about the use of lethal force. He has spoken about this with a directness that surprised many people. He confirmed in his memoir that he killed people. He said he was taught to see them in a certain way that made the job possible, as chess pieces rather than people, and that he later had to reckon with what that framework had cost him. But during the years of his military service, Harry was not reckoning with anything. He was numbing. He has described the decade between his mother's death in 1997 and the beginning of his mental health crisis in approximately 2012 as a period of almost complete emotional shutdown. He went to parties, he was photographed at clubs, he was friendly and funny and charming in the way that people who are working very hard not to feel anything can be, because the performance of lightness requires enormous energy and leaves very little room for anything else. He did not grieve Diana for 20 years. He has said this plainly. He went to her funeral, he walked behind her coffin, he watched them put her in the ground, and then he put the grief in a box and put the box somewhere he could not easily find it and got on with things. Because getting on with things was what was required. Because he was 12, and then 13, and then 16, and then 20, and no one, not the palace, not the therapists who were briefly made available, and then not Charles, not even William, sat him down and said, "You are allowed to fall apart, and here is a safe place to do it." The crisis, when it finally arrived in his late 20s. He has described it as a gradual accumulation that suddenly became impossible to manage, the grief he had never processed. The identity crisis of being the spare, of having no clear role, of watching William's life have a shape and a direction and a purpose, while his own seemed to be primarily defined by what it was not. The pressure of the cameras, which had been constant since his birth and which had killed his mother and which were pointed at him every time he stepped outside. The military service, which had been sustaining and which had also left him with experiences that required processing he was not doing. He started therapy. He has said it saved him. He has also said that the 2 years before he started therapy were among the darkest of his life, and that he came close during that period to simply not continuing. He has never been more specific than that, and he doesn't need to be. The implication is clear. He met Meghan Markle in 2016. They were set up on a blind date by a mutual friend who thought they might get along. They did. They spoke on the phone for hours before they met in person, and by the time they actually sat across from each other, they had already established the beginnings of something real. Meghan was unlike anyone Harry had been seriously involved with before. She was American, she was biracial, she was a successful actress with her own established career, her own income, her own public profile, and her own very clear sense of who she was. She was not waiting to be defined by a relationship with a prince. She had already defined herself. Harry fell in love with her with a speed and a completeness that surprised people who knew him. Those close to him said they had never seen him like that the combination of therapy and meeting Meghan had unlocked something in him that had been closed for a very long time. They announced their engagement in November 2017. The interview they gave was warm and easy and so visibly genuine that even the most cynical royal watchers had a hard time finding much to criticize in it. Harry spoke about Meghan with an openness that his father had never managed with Diana, and that William, for all his genuine love for Catherine, expressed in a more contained register. Harry was simply, plainly, embarrassingly happy, and he was not interested in pretending otherwise. The wedding was May 19, 2018. Windsor Castle. An African-American bishop named Michael Curry delivered a sermon about love that went viral around the world. The Kingdom Choir sang. Meghan walked the first part of the aisle alone, and then Charles met her and walked her the rest of the way, a gesture that Harry had asked him to make. The sun came out over Windsor and the photographs were extraordinary, and everyone watching wanted it to be the beginning of something good. It was, instead, the beginning of something very complicated. The institution, the press, and the choice that broke a family. What happened between the wedding in May 2018 and the announcement in January 2020 that Harry and Meghan were stepping back from senior royal duties is a story that has been told from so many directions, with so many contradictions and contested versions, that arriving at clean factual ground is genuinely difficult. Here is what is not disputed. The British tabloid press covered Meghan Markle with an intensity and a hostility that began almost immediately after the relationship became public and escalated steadily through the engagement, the wedding, and the early months of her life as a working royal. Stories about her behavior towards staff, stories about her relationship with her father, who had posed for paparazzi photographs and then given interviews to tabloids that Meghan found deeply hurtful. Stories that characterized behavior that was presented as charming in other royals as difficult or demanding when Meghan did it. Stories whose framing, whose word choices, whose assumptions about what required explanation and what did not, reflected in Harry's view and in the view of many media observers a double standard that had everything to do with race. Harry watched this happen and saw it through the lens of his mother. Diana had been destroyed by the British tabloid press. Not metaphorically, literally. The photographers who chased her car into that Paris tunnel were employed by newspapers that made money from photographs of Diana, whether she was happy or suffering, and the suffering photographs often sold better. Harry had grown up knowing this. He had spent his entire life knowing this. And now he was watching the same press, the same newspapers, some of them literally the same editors, turn their attention to his wife, and the coverage had a particular quality that he found intolerable. He sued. He launched legal action against multiple British tabloids for phone hacking and other forms of illegal information gathering. These cases were not frivolous. They produced evidence, in multiple cases, of systematic illegal activity by British newspapers against members of the royal family and other public figures. Harry pursued them with a determination that surprised and in some cases alarmed the palace, because the palace's traditional approach to the press was management and accommodation, not confrontation, and Harry was done with management and accommodation. The institution, meanwhile, was not providing the protection Harry felt his wife needed. He has said that when he raised concerns with senior members of the family about the press coverage, he was told that the best approach was to keep quiet and let it blow over. That this was simply the price of royal life, that they had all been through it. He heard this and he thought about his mother, about what keeping quiet and letting it blow over had cost her, about the 15 years of press intrusion and public consumption that had preceded the crash in the Pont Alma tunnel, and he was not willing to let history repeat itself. Meghan, for her part, was struggling. She has said in the interview with Oprah Winfrey in March 2021 that during the period before Archie's birth in May 2019, she was having thoughts of not wanting to be alive anymore, that she had gone to the institution seeking help, seeking access to mental health resources, and been told it wasn't possible because it would not look good. That she had sat next to Harry at a public event the night before smiling when she was in crisis. Harry confirmed this. He sat beside Oprah and Meghan and confirmed that his wife had told him she was not coping and that he had been afraid, the specific and particular fear of a man who had already lost one woman he loved to a system that failed her, that he was watching the system fail another. Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor was born on May 6, 2019. He was not given a royal title, a choice that Harry and Meghan said was theirs and that others said reflected a palace decision about whether Meghan's children would be treated as fully royal. This dispute over a title, over what it meant, became one of the first public fractures between Harry and the institution. Then, in January 2020, they announced the step back. The statement they released was careful and considered and attempted to describe a new arrangement in which they would remain part of the royal family while also having the freedom to build a life with financial independence and reduced security obligations. The palace responded with a statement of its own that was notably less cooperative in tone. The Queen's statement made clear that the discussions about such an arrangement had not been concluded and that the institution's preference was for Harry and Meghan to remain in their existing roles. What followed was a summit at Sandringham in which the terms were worked out, and the terms were, essentially, that the step back was not partial but complete. They would not keep their royal patronages. They would not retain their HRH styling in an operational sense. They would give up their security arrangements, which was a decision that Harry has since said put his family in genuine danger and which he has fought through the courts to reverse. They moved to Canada first, then to California. Archie was a toddler. Lilibet Diana Mountbatten Windsor was born in June 2021, named after the Queen and after Diana, a gesture that managed to be both deeply personal and, in the context of everything that had happened, also slightly pointed. The Oprah interview was March 7, 2021. 90 minutes that were watched by 49 million people on the first night of broadcast, and which produced a series of moments that functioned like depth charges in the public conversation about the monarchy. Meghan discussing her mental health crisis and the institution's failure to respond to it. Harry discussing the financial arrangements and the cutting off of his security, and a moment referenced obliquely but clearly understood, in which Meghan said that during her pregnancy there had been conversations within the royal family about what color Archie's skin would be. The palace issued a single-paragraph response that said the issues raised were concerning and would be addressed privately. It did not address the specific allegations. It noted that recollections can vary. Recollections can vary became, almost immediately, a phrase that will follow the monarchy for decades. The Netflix documentary, released in December 2022, went further. 6 episodes, footage from inside their life that the palace had no ability to manage or contextualize. Harry and Meghan telling their version of events in their own words, with their own framing, to a global audience, completely outside the institutional apparatus that had for 300 years controlled the royal family's public narrative. Spare was published in January 2023, a memoir by a serving member of the royal family, written in the first person, containing specific conversations with named relatives, specific grievances, specific accusations. It broke sales records. It was the fastest-selling nonfiction book in history in the United Kingdom. It contained a moment in which Harry described a physical altercation with William, in which William had grabbed him by the collar and knocked him to the floor in the kitchen of Harry's home. William did not publicly respond to this specific allegation. The palace did not comment. William and Harry, what a relationship looks like when it breaks. The relationship between William and Harry has been one of the most analyzed and most misunderstood things in public life for the last several years. Everyone has a theory about it. Almost no one has actual information. What can be said is this: they were genuinely close. Not performed close, not close for the cameras, but close in the way that two people who have been through the same catastrophic experience and survived it together are close. They had Diana. They lost Diana. They walked behind her coffin together. They stood at her grave together. They had for years a relationship of genuine mutual understanding that did not require explanation, because the explanation was the same for both of them and neither of them needed to give it. They worked together on the Heads Together mental health campaign and spoke publicly about grief and loss and the need for emotional honesty in ways that were clearly genuine. In 2017, for the anniversary of Diana's death, they gave an interview in which both of them spoke about their mother, with a rawness that surprised people who were accustomed to royal restraint. Harry talked about wishing he had made more of the last phone call he had with her. He had been in a hurry to get off the phone. He had not known it was the last time he would speak to her. He carried that. The fracture, when it came, did not come all at once. It is not possible to locate a single moment when the relationship between William and Harry went from being the thing that anchored them both to being the thing that defined the crisis. It accumulated. It was the press coverage of Meghan and the institution's response to it. It was disagreements about how to handle things, about what the palace owed Harry and Meghan, and about what Harry and Meghan owed the institution. It was, according to Harry, a specific conversation in which William told him he couldn't just do whatever he wanted, that there were rules, that this was bigger than both of them. And it was, underneath all of that, two people who had processed the same grief in completely opposite ways, finally arriving at a point where the difference in their processing was no longer compatible with the closeness they had shared. William had internalized the institution. He had made his peace with it, found a way to live inside its constraints and serve its purposes without losing himself entirely. He believed, as far as anyone can tell from the outside, that the institution was worth protecting, that the monarchy had value, and that the value required certain sacrifices, and that Harry's choices were making it harder to protect the thing they both stood to inherit. Harry had decided the institution was the problem. He had lived inside it for 35 years, had watched it fail his mother and then watched it, as he saw it, begin to fail his wife. And he had concluded that the loyalty the institution demanded was not being reciprocated with the protection it owed. He left. Neither of them is simply right. Neither of them is simply wrong. They are two people who loved the same woman and lost her to the same system and arrived at different conclusions about what that meant for how to live. Diana's granddaughter and what she was named. Lilibet Diana Mountbatten Windsor was born on June 4, 2021, at Santa Barbara Cottage Hospital in California. She was named after her great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, whose family nickname was Lilibet, and after her grandmother, Diana. The choice of the middle name was not a coincidence or a sentiment, it was a statement. Diana had been gone for nearly 24 years by the time Lilibet was born, and Harry was still carrying her, still naming his daughter after her, still insisting that she be present in the family even from an ocean away. There is something both moving and slightly heartbreaking about that, about the persistence of a son's grief taking the form of a name given to a daughter who will never meet the grandmother she was named for. Archie is 4 now. Lilibet is 3. They are growing up in Montecito, California, with security arrangements that their father has had to fight for in the courts, in a life that is both more private and more exposed than anything Diana envisioned when she drove through McDonald's drive-thrus in disguise, trying to give her boys something ordinary. Harry has spoken about wanting to raise Archie and Lilibet differently from how he was raised, with more openness, with the space to be ordinary, with the understanding that they are people first and symbols, if they are symbols at all, a very distant second. He is doing essentially what Diana tried to do, and finding, as Diana found, that the world has a very strong and persistent interest in the children of people it has decided to watch, what they carry, and what was left. Queen Elizabeth II died on September 8, 2022, at Balmoral Castle, the same place where William and Harry had been told their mother was dead 25 years earlier. The symmetry of it is not lost on anyone who has followed this family. Charles became King Charles III. William became Prince of Wales, the title Diana had held, and which carried enormous symbolic weight for reasons that everyone understood and no one said plainly. Catherine became Princess of Wales. Harry and Meghan flew to the UK when the Queen was dying. There are photographs of them walking with William and Catherine outside Windsor Castle in the days following the death, looking at the flowers that had been left by the public, and the photographs were analyzed with forensic intensity by people looking for signs of warmth or its absence. The signs were ambiguous. They walked, they looked at the flowers, they did not appear to speak much. At the funeral, they were in the same spaces. They were not photographed together in any sustained way that suggested the relationship between them had recovered. It has not recovered. As of the writing of this story, Harry and William have not had any publicly confirmed contact of significance since the funeral. Harry returned to California. William continued his duties as Prince of Wales. The distance between them is geographical and also something much harder to close than geography. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, Diana is present. In the ring Catherine wears, in the name Lilibet carries, in the mental health conversations William has had publicly and the therapy Harry has spoken about privately, in the shelter visits that William organized for his own children, taking George and Charlotte to see homelessness and poverty in ways that echoed what Diana had done with him. In the warmth that both brothers show with their children, the ease with which they hold them, the lack of the royal stiffness that characterized previous generations. She is present in what both of them are afraid of. William is afraid of failure, of not being enough for a role that is everything, of letting down the institution that his grandmother gave her life to and that his mother died fighting. Harry is afraid of repetition, of watching the people he loves destroyed by the same machine that destroyed his mother, of his children growing up with the same wound he carries. Both fears are hers. She gave them both. She spent her life trying to protect them from exactly the things they are afraid of, and she could not protect them because she ran out of time and because the institution that required the protection is larger than any single person's love. She was 36 years old. She had been raising them for 15 years. She had 12 more years of mothering to give William and 10 more years to give Harry. Those years were taken from all three of them by a drunk driver in a tunnel in Paris who was being chased by photographers employed by newspapers that made money from the life of the most watched woman on earth. William is now 42 years old. He is going to be king. He has 3 children who will grow up in the institution Diana feared, but who will grow up knowing that their father tried, at least sometimes, to protect them from the worst of it. Harry is 39, living in California with his wife and his 2 children, estranged from his brother, and in a complicated and unresolved relationship with the country he grew up in. He is still fighting the press and the courts. He is still carrying his mother in the name he gave his daughter, and in the grief he finally learned to access, and in the choices he makes every day about what the institution is and is not worth. Neither of them is healed. Neither of them is finished. The story of what Diana's death did to her sons is still being written, in real time, by 2 men who are still, underneath everything, the boys who were woken before dawn in a Scottish castle and told that their mother was gone. They are her legacy, both of them, the one who stayed inside the institution and the one who left, the one who learned to contain his grief and the one who finally opened it up, the one who will be king and the one who named his daughter Diana. She raised them to feel. They are still feeling. After everything the world has done with them and to them and around them, they are still unmistakably her sons. That has to count for something. That has to count for everything. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.